a rainbow thread. Just a reminder for the last, how do I get that light out of there? There we go. For the last, this is our 5th week. We have been studying texts from Noam Sienna's A Rainbow Thread to, I always forget the subtitle, An Anthology of Queer Jewish Texts from the 1st Century to 1969. And someone put something. Sima says, please advise, I cannot hear you. Everyone else can hear me, right? Yep. My advice is maybe see if you can turn up your volume. Maybe you have it accidentally on all the way down. So we've been going through these texts a 5th at a time for the 5 weeks and going through them chronologically. So the first thing to say, and I can't remember if we've talked about this or not, but why is it from the 1st century to 1969? Why 1969?
Because of Stonewall.
And will you remind us what Stonewall is for those who are less familiar?
It was a bar in New York City, and they were always raiding it, the cops, and so they raided it one night in June of 1969, and the people who were present said, we've had enough of this, and they started a riot, which lasted for about 4 or 5 days, and that was the beginning of people getting rights for LGBT people in the U.S.
Nice, thank you. So why end in 1969?
Wasn't that when the letter was written to the main board of the Jewish thing that said, the people from Boca that said, why?
Okay, yeah. And we're going to look at that text today. But I think Noam's answer to this question, the author, would be, why do we go until 1969? Because 1969, with Stonewall and the revolution that it starts, really creates, in some ways, a brand new era when it comes to LGBTQ equality and rights. And right, we are in a profoundly different era, I think would be his point. Not to mention that there are just like so many more texts that you can choose from that point forward, right? And he's talked about creating something of a compendium when it comes to, but that's the final date that we are looking at. Was someone saying something? Sorry. We are in a profoundly different era. Oh no, I'm hearing myself. There are just like some speakers now. I am going to go ahead and preemptively mute everyone. Creating something of a yeah, there we go. And you can unmute yourself whenever you want to talk. Okay. Any other thoughts on that before we dive into some texts here? Any lingering thoughts from the last 4 weeks or the last week or whenever it was? Anyone have? We'll certainly save some time at the end to process all of this. Okay. So again, you can unmute yourself whenever there is something to say. I thought we would actually start with one of the final texts in the book, which is the text we were just referencing. Where do we go? Here we go. And this, if you've got the book, is going to be on page 399. Okay. So this is a classic rabbinic genre of text. Oop, I almost hit end the meeting for everyone. This is a classic genre of rabbinic text. It's the genre of the Shela in the Chu. Page 399. Someone just unmuted themselves, okay. And now. So this is a classic rabbinic genre of text. So whoever has unmuted themselves. Everyone. This is a classic genre of rabbinic text. Where are we getting this to? It's the genre of the. There we go. Lisa, it's your speakers that when you're unmuted, we're getting the voices cycling back through. So I'm gonna leave you muted until you have something specific to say and then just unmute yourself, okay? Okay, so this is this classic genre of rabbinic literature, Shela and Tshuva, the question and answer that you get. So first, let's talk broadly about how this fits into.
So I'm gonna leave you muted until you have something specific.
I'm muting you again, Lisa. Sorry. It's just the echo coming through your speaker.
Literature, Shela and Tshuva, the question and answer that you.
So if you don't mind leaving yourself muted there. Okay, so we have going back to the place of the tshuva, the Shela and the tshuva in rabbinic literature. So broadly thinking, and don't push too hard on this analogy that I'm going to give here, but broadly thinking, you can imagine the place of the Talmud, certainly the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, as being something like the Constitution. And the moment that the Talmud is finished, there is the introduction of what we would call case law, meaning the Talmud is this unwieldy body of rabbinic thinking and legal thinking, but it's almost impossible, as anyone who's ever tried to do this knows, or anyone who's studied any Talmud knows, to have a specific question about a specific situation and go to the Talmud thinking you can look it up. Certainly nothing's in a place where you might imagine it to be, but beyond that, you're more likely to, spend 3 years studying an issue and have less of an idea what the answer is, right? That for those who've been doing Talmud on Tuesday nights with me for a few years now, right? It's something of a joke that the first question we started with was, what happens if there are two people coming holding a valuable cloth and they both claim that they found it? Who gets it? And we're no closer to an answer. In fact, we're farther, I think, from an answer than we were at the first class 2 years later. So what happens is that there is this new form of literature that arises. The Shela and the Tshuva, the question and the answer, also they're called responsa. Also, you can use whatever word you want, same idea. And this is effectively case law, where rabbis are asked specific questions. It started out that people in Spain would send their questions to Babylon, and the Gaons, the leaders of these institutions, they would answer the specific question using their Talmudic knowledge to the answer. But then what happens is all of these practical answers that are answered over time themselves become the basis for later practical answers that people are building upon. And in that sense, it works like case law in the United States and the legal system here. Okay, did that make sense? Any questions on that? Any comments on that? Thoughts on that?
Where is this case law?
So, right, there's no set body of case law that you can go to. Lisa says that her audio is muted, but still getting echoes. Weird. I don't know what to tell you, Lisa. Sorry. So there's no specific place you can go to because there's no Supreme Court for Judaism. So there's never been a body that is there to say this is established law and everyone follows it. So instead, the answer is people follow a particular rabbinic ruling because they follow that particular rabbinic ruling. And so rabbis throughout the last 1,000 years of Jewish history, their rulings are followed because other people follow their rulings. There's no senior body, there's no pope, obviously, right? Okay. Any questions on that? So this continues today, this setup. And in the Reform movement, there's all sorts of questions that come in to be addressed. Just a little note, anyone who's watching this on Facebook, if you'd like, you can click on the link on the top and it'll bring you to Zoom and you can be a part of the conversation also. Okay, so this continues today. I guess we don't need to share the text right now. This continues today where we have these questions that come in. I'm on the committee for the Reform movement. You'd think being on the committee, I could remember the name of the committee's name, but it's not the Law and Standards Committee. It's the Responsa Committee. I don't know what it's called. But people continue to send in questions that are addressed. So in particular, the committee just, I'll confess I put no energy into this last set, but the committee just addressed all sorts of practical questions of, can you make a minyan to say Kaddish via Zoom, things like that. So they deal with all sorts of contemporary questions and issues. So this text, at least as it was presented to me by Noam a couple months ago when I was with him in New York, back when we all could do things like travel to other places, he presented this text that we're about to look at as something of a mission statement or an inspiration for this book itself. So I thought we would start with it today and use it sort of as a set piece. We'll look at some other texts too, but really use it as a set piece to discuss this whole project that we've done over the last now 5 weeks. Okay, any questions on any of that before I put up the texts? Okay, here we go. Who feels like reading?
I can read.
Please.
Okay, you want to start with the group in the temple?
Correct. And this is a question to the Reform Responsive Committee, the same committee that I mentioned I'm a part of today.
Okay, a group in the temple is planning a discussion program on the question of homosexuality. What then is there in Jewish law on this subject? Considering the prevalence of
Okay,
homosexuality.
hold on, pause for a second. So that was the question, and now we're going to get the answer. Does that make sense? So first of all, I think it's worth saying that like in 1969, it's actually kind of amazing that a temple in Israel, a temple in Florida, little different than Israel,
Not really.
temple was putting on a program like this, right? Okay, let's look at the answer.
Considering the prevalence of homosexuality in the East, one can say in general that it is remarkable how little place the whole question occupies in Jewish law.
Okay. So first of all, this is one of the takeaways I have from this book. Did anyone else have a pre-existing association between Easternness, Orientalism, and I'm using that word on purpose for all of its problematics because I think that's what we're talking about here, in association with queerness and the East or the Orient? Did anyone else? I had no association with that prior to this book, A Rainbow Thread, and yet it's clear that for much of the last few thousand years, that was an association, particularly as we enter more into the modern era. Did anyone else know that or heard that or anything? Is that new to everyone else too?
No, yes, I did have some sense of that from traveling in the Middle East and countries like Egypt, and I spent some time in Turkey, and you very often saw, particularly men, holding hands, expressing physical affection in public. And in both places, it was explained to me that that was quite acceptable.
Okay.
And that, even though these men would, later marry women, or maybe they were married to women, that they had these very close relationships with other men.
So that was really something of an aside, but I never had that association before. And it's clear that for a long time, particularly in Western Europe and in the United States, that was a strong association.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, please.
For Renee, can you describe how women were treated when you visited, I think you said Turkey?
Yeah, and also when I was in Egypt, and we're talking here about the late 70s and the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of ways, women were just sort of invisible.
Yep.
I mean, I was traveling with 2 gay men, and if for some reason I was separated from them, like they were doing something else, if I sat down in a cafe, nobody would wait on me. Nobody would talk to me. And this would sometimes be explained to me that that was a mark of respect, that people would, the men wouldn't bother me. Of course, as a Westerner, it offended me, but I was, traveling in a very, very different culture, and I was curious about it.
And I should have been clear, actually. The texts, at least as I've encountered them in this book, are pretty explicit that what they're talking about is male-male homosexual sexuality.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
assumption was that the women were home with the children, and that was that.
Right. And I just thought I'd pipe in that a friend of mine that was in Istanbul just recently for a layover, she's female and she's got a rather large frame, had pretty much the same experience that you're talking about, Renee. And in fact, men would come directly walking at her, and a guide that she had hired for a 6-hour layover tour had to step in between her and the man for the man to deflect his pattern of walking. So I think women are still treated as second-class citizens in very many places in the world.
Some would say this country too.
Yes. Yeah,
okay,
I agree with that, Daniel. I'm not allowed to say it in my chosen profession, but I agree.
Okay, let's jump back in here.
Oh, can I say them? Am I unmuted? Hi, this is Helene. I had a very similar experience when I was in Thailand and Indonesia in 1990. But for the many years that I went to gift shows and would hang out with the importers, most of whom were from Southeast Asia and India, the men would sit in the booths or at the tables with their arms draped across each other in a very friendly manner. And so my question is this the non-Christian countries where it is more acceptable for men to be that close to friends? And we'd see it with the little children going to school. They would have their arms draped around each other. But again, the women, are second class and at home. But I really thought that was beautiful because we don't have that same freedom, even like women to women, or men to men, to show that kind of closeness.
Okay, let's jump back into this text.
After the biblical prohibitions, there is almost nothing in the Mishnah, Talmud, and codes on the question. The Talmud itself explains, perhaps unconscious of the fact that it is explaining it, why there is so little discussion of the question. In B. Kiddushin 82a, it discusses the prohibition of seclusion, yehud, with any of the forbidden sexual degrees of relationship, i.e. a man must avoid being or must... Did somebody stop me? Or must not be permitted to be alone with a woman with whom he is forbidden to have a sexual relationship. Then the Talmud says that Jewish people are not under the suspicion of homosexuality, i.e. it is highly improbable among Jews, and therefore it is not forbidden for a Jewish man to be alone with another Jewish man.
Okay, what are we seeing here? How is this rabbi in 1969, the Reform movement, remember the most progressive movement in Judaism? What's happening here?
He's denying that homosexuality exists in the Jewish community, basically.
Yeah, right. There's definitely a little bit of that Iran kind of thing going on here, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, he also assumes that in Torah, it prohibits a homosexual relationship.
Therefore, nobody does it.
Right.
Say, Larry, you cut out for me. Will you say that again? I'm sorry.
I said he's basically saying in Torah, a homosexual relationship is forbidden.
So,
or even in the Jewish Bible, he doesn't even deal with David and Jonathan.
Sure. Well, remember that David and Jonathan, yeah, let's put that aside for a moment. What he's really dealing with is really picking up this notion of Leviticus 18:22, right? A man shall not lie with a man as he does with a woman. To do so is an abomination. Now, there's all sorts of contemporary reads that do all sorts of things with this, but at its shot level, we're talking about penetrative sex between two men. Like that is the...
I'm sorry, Daniel, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna ask a question. If I'm reading this wrong, then I'm sorry. But are they just denying it? What I'm saying is they don't want to believe it, that a man is alone with a man.
So what they're referencing here, he's going through this rabbi, right? And he's in 1969, he's trying to answer the question, what does Judaism have to say about homosexuality? And what he's doing is he's trying to find examples where it talks about this. And so he's going, this is a rather famous section of the Talmud in Kiddushin, where there is a discussion on who can be alone with someone else, the laws of Yichud. If people heard about these laws before, right? If you've seen the show Shtisel, has anyone seen that by a show of hands? Okay, so if you haven't seen Shtisel, you should go watch Shtisel on Netflix. It's great. And there's another one, I don't know if it's a spinoff for Unorthodox, everyone keeps telling me to watch. I haven't watched it yet. It's with one of the actresses, I think, at least. But you'll see one of the shticks you see in Shtisel over and over again is if there's a man and a woman alone together in a room or an apartment and they're not married, they'll leave the door open, like the door to the outside of the apartment. Does that make sense? And that's because there are these very practical laws that exist about who can be alone with someone else. Does that, not that this should be a good thing, but does that make sense as a setup? So their point is that in this section of the Talmud, it specifically says that two men can be alone together because Jews are not suspected of two men having sex with each other. That just doesn't happen amongst the Jews. Ignore the last 4 weeks of this class. Okay, let's keep going.
There is an interesting development of this Talmudic statement in the way this dictum that Jews are not suspected, etc., is carried over to the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch.
The Shulchan Aruch is, so Becky's question earlier was about like, where do you find all of these case laws, these rulings? And the answer is by, when's the Shulchan Aruch? 1400s or 14th century? I never remember. One of those two. Yosef Karo. By the time we get around to, I don't know, a few hundred years later, there's been so much case law that's been built up that even knowing all the case law is unwieldy. So instead what we get are these things known as the codes, where they are taking the entirety of case law that's been built atop the Talmud and creating practical guides to Jewish life. The Shulchan Aruch is probably the most significant of them, certainly from this era. The other two worth mentioning, Rambam Maimonides, the Mishnah Torah, and then one from the 1800s, the Mishnah Brura, which continues to be one of the sort of guideposts of orthodoxy today. So Shulchan Aruch, incredibly important Jewish compendium law.
Okay. The Shulchan Aruch in Even Hotzer 24 states that the law is derived from the Talmud, that since Jewish men are suspected of homosexuality, they are not forbidden to be alone with each other. Then Joseph Caro adds, however, in these generations, when sinful men have increased, it is better to avoid isolation with another male. Moses Rifkis, Poland, 17th century, in his Be'er HaGolah, gives the Talmudic reference for the first part of the statement. But as for the latter part of the statement, nowadays when evil men have increased, etc., he notes carefully, these are his own words. There is no reference for this precaution in the Talmudic literature, and Joseph Caro makes the precaution on his own authority. Why should Joseph Caro have made such an extra precaution with which the Talmud does not require against males being secluded together? The Beis Shemuel, Samuel of Firth, explains in the name of Joel Sirchus, Poland, 16th century, that in the land in which he, Caro, lived, homosexuality was rampant.
In the East.
But not in our land. Hence, it is not required for males to avoid isolation. Okay, so see Bach de Tour, same reference. Of course, this is correct historically. The Arab lands were notorious for homosexuality, and Joseph Caro knew that.
Right, see, here's that reference we had earlier, yep.
But to the rest of Jewry, it seemed far-fetched to prohibit males to associate with each other for fear of homosexuality. My. Now, as to the biblical sources, they are Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13.
So we can skip that.
Okay, you know that part. How far skip?
Yeah, skip to this final paragraph right here. All in all.
All in all, considering how much detail there is in the law on every kind of forbidden sexual relationship, the very paucity of biblical and post-biblical law on the matter speaks well for the normalcy and purity of the Jewish people.
Okay, so right, a pretty gross and bigoted ending here. What's the takeaway from this? If we were going to summarize this tshuva here, this response.
That there's nothing there because it just never happened. And it's just, you can't write about something that didn't happen.
Okay. Right. So in some ways, I kind of wish we could go back in time, and I know we started a rainbow thread by describing this, but really studying this as our very first text, because this became the mission statement, or the I don't know, inspiration. I guess that's a better word. Anti-inspiration. I don't know what, there's got to be a word for this, for this book as a whole, because this is a reform movement.
It's the impetus for the book.
Impetus, that's the word I was looking for. Thank you. So any thoughts on this text, or this approach, or this idea, or any of this?
I think it's kind of remarkable how the responder here goes out of his way to other gay men, particularly. You can see that in the orientalization, and then again, that extra layer of homosexuality, where there's very clear distinctions between us and other. And, you know, he's kind of ignoring the fact that there might be people because it doesn't fit with his concept, you know, with the normalcy and purity, you know.
Yep. Nice. Nice. Yeah. And that's one of the themes we're going to come back to throughout today, that I think we're going to see. And in some ways, these are going to feel more contemporary, right? Because these are, well, I guess, of course, they'll feel more contemporary. They're contemporary texts, but they're going to have a flavor of a homophobia that we're familiar with, rather than the homophobia of 1,000 years ago, which is a different kind of homophobia, right? Like it's dealing with contemporary categories, in some ways the worst of those categories. Okay, any other thoughts before we jump into another text?
Is he saying that in 1969 there weren't any Jewish male homosexuals?
He seems to, yeah, maybe, or at least that they are influenced by others, or what, right? That this just isn't a Jewish thing.
They keep that blind eye going.
Yeah.
They don't want to believe it.
Okay.
But I think there's a lot of cultures that say the same thing. This is Sima, that say the same thing. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah. So it's not just, I mean, it's current day, it's that way too. So he's obviously not based in reality. He probably knows there is, and he's just trying to even dictate a certain way of life or influence somebody's thoughts. I mean, there's a million different reasons why somebody would say those things out loud, or even believe those things, whether they do or don't. There's modern examples of that today.
Oh, yeah. Any other thoughts before we jump into another text?
Well, it also reminds me, you know, in my youth, not that I ever even heard the word homosexual in any Hebrew class or Sunday school class, but I was frequently told, you know, things like, oh, Jewish men don't beat their wives, and there's no alcoholism in the Jewish community. And, you know, I think, and believe me, I'm not at all drawing any kind of parallels between, you know, those issues and homosexuality, gayness. It's just that it was perceived at that point that, and I think this was especially true in the Reform Jewish movement, that there was this effort made to be made to have the Jewish community and the Jewish people look, you know, particularly blemishless, you know, in regard to attitudes in the, you know, widespread community about behaviors that were frowned upon. I don't know, but it's just this sort of like, instead you got books about how many Jews were Nobel Prize winners and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I mean, despite the rather shocking ignorance, and the denial that's sort of classic in this text, I think it was, I heard a lot of that when I was growing up, about how Jews had a certain kind of superiority because they didn't indulge in certain kinds of behavior, which of course turns
Renee,
out not to be so.
Renee, that's interesting because I just thought it's absolutely intentional for them to not speak of these things
Yeah.
or to inflate our egos or inflate us in some way so that way we either not looked down upon by others or even by ourselves,
Right.
to be, and so I just think about how intentional it is. I mean, there's people, obviously there are examples back then, there's people now, we have perfect examples, everything is rosy.
Mhm.
And so maybe the behaviors haven't changed very much over the decades.
Yeah.
So let's jump back in time 15 years before this. Oh, no, that's not the button I want to hit. So is anyone familiar with One magazine? Had anyone heard of this? Oop, nope, that's not what I wanted to share either. Sorry. Anyone? No, One is new. From 1953 to 1969, based in Los Angeles, there was a magazine called One, the Homosexual Magazine, a monthly that was sent out, or that you could subscribe to, presumably. So this is it in there. It's given under a I never know how to say that word. Pseudonym? Is that how you say it? Pseudonym? How do you say it? Someone's fake name.
Pseudonym.
Oh, pseudonym.
Pseudonym. Yeah. Thank you. Given under the name of the person today, and it is a report on, how does it? An American homophile magazine reports on homosexuality in Israel, is how this is described by Noam. So this is an interesting letter here, or an article here, I guess. Just something to hold on to. Again, the ways that Orientalism are going to very much be, even in a magazine by the queer community for the community, the ways that Orientalism is sort of infusing things. Okay, someone want to read?
Many people believe that Israel is like the Orient in its reception of the homosexual. In some respects, the Orient and East Asia are ideal for the gay element. Nothing is less difficult in Istanbul, in Algiers, in Casablanca, or in Cairo than to make a friendly acquaintance by a quite obvious approach, and to know at the same time that you do so without danger.
So I just want to hold on to how different of a perception of what life was like for, and they're talking about gay men here, right? For gay men in the Arab world in 1955 than how we perceive the safety of gay men in the Arab world might be today.
It's very dangerous for gay men in Egypt or countries to have any perception of being gay.
And that's at least my perception of what that is, right? And he's dealing with a different perception here. So anyways, I just wanted to hold on to that for a moment, but okay, let's keep going.
Oh, at times it is true, one must pay for his amusement, but it is also possible to find a lasting friendship of more permanent worth. In this way, conditions in Israel are very similar to those of the Orient. The country is populated by a remarkable mixture of people, many from other places. Its atmosphere is thus cosmopolitan, as one might expect. However, the culture of Israel is more Occidental than Oriental, and in some ways, much like that of the states of Europe. The laws are very mild against the homosexual. One could say they hardly exist at all. Of course, if a case were to arise involving a minor, such as a boy of 13, both parties would be brought to trial.
So pause for a second there. It's just worth noting that a number of the earlier texts that we looked at, particularly texts that were looking at sexual relationships between two men, assumed that the nature of that sexual relationship was one in which one was an older adult and one was a teenager.
People still do that.
Yeah, but it's a different, we're starting to get into a different understanding and a more sort of modern era understanding of what abuse is too.
It's really getting better.
Okay, let's keep going. Unless there are other comments, feel free to jump in if anyone has one.
Except for imports from Europe, there are not many homosexuals living in Israel. For this reason, bars and clubs exclusively for the gay cannot exist.
Okay, let's take that apart for a second, because remember that this is a gay man writing for a queer magazine about queer life in Israel. What is he saying?
There's not enough gay bars, enough gay people so that they can have gay bars, basically.
Okay.
And I think he's just making that up.
Okay, yeah, interestingly, right, we already heard about, wasn't it last week that we read about gay bars in Tel Aviv and in Jaffa, right?
Yeah, decades before this.
Yeah, decades before this. But if we're going to hold on, let's look a little more here, because he also just talked about how this is a very friendly place for men who have sex with each other. So what does he mean here by homosexuals?
I think what we see here is the difference between sort of something that happened in the 19th century where homosexuality, the identity, began to be separated from just homogenital behavior. You know, a man could be with another man and then would go on to marry a woman and consider himself, you know, the term straight wasn't being used, but in his mind consider himself to be the kind of person who's attracted to women and incidentally has sex with men, as opposed to someone who primarily has emotional and physical relationships with someone of the same gender.
Nice. The only thing I would add from some of the earlier texts that we looked at too is that actually a number of the texts that we looked at, even from 1500 years ago, seem to normalize actually that the location of your main spiritual partner and emotional partner, and maybe even your main sexual partner for a man might be another man, your chavruta, and the incidental sex that happens is with this man's wife that he's required to go home and have sex with occasionally from the yeshiva. But yeah, thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. That's a really good highlight.
So, right, we're dealing with a change in the notion of identity here. Okay, let's keep going.
Okay, where were we?
Except for
except for import. Didn't we read that? Okay,
it's okay, dude. Just for a second.
Except for imports from Europe, there are not many homosexuals living in Israel. For this reason, bars and clubs exclusively for the gay cannot exist. What happens in practice is that most natives are either heterosexual without taking the matter seriously or bisexual, but few are what could be called pure homosexuals. Of course, the younger set know all about the question and play along with it. No one is openly hostile, unpleasant, or upsetting. On the contrary.
So interesting even here that we have this sense of like how identity is changing generationally. Okay, let's keep going.
At the same time, there are those living in Israel, a ring of people who come from the Orient, from India, Iran, Libya, Africa, etc. These persons are Jews, but in their natures are like Orientals. They are the Muslims.
Okay, pause for a second. So there's the obvious part that's absurd here. But the other thing I want to hold on to is that for the early Zionists, Israel was supposed to be a homeland for white Jews, right? It was supposed to be a homeland fundamentally for European Jews. And it's only after the Holocaust we find like some of the early founders of Israel we have writings where they say things like what I'm about to say, where they talk about how, oh, I guess now that all of the Jews of Europe have been murdered, we'll have to take in all of those Jews from the Orient because that's our only demographic choice. But there was, and in many ways continues to be, significant Jewish racism from European Jews against the groups we now call Sephardi Jews, here are called Arab Jews, right? And we see that here, almost even denying that they're essentially Jewish. Like in some ways, they're not totally Jews. Okay, thoughts?
Real quick, is that possibly the reason why he seems to think that homosexuals are imports from Europe? I thought that was kind of a weird comment for him to make. Is that possibly feeding into that concept that, you know, European Jews are going to be the ones that are more cultured, or
Yeah.
He's from the perspective as a gay man, so he would want that. He's not really interested in, you know, gay for, you know, a few months or a few years. You know, he prioritizes a long-term partner.
I can't remember if we are looking at this text today or not, but one of the texts in A Rainbow Thread really directly addressed that, where it talked about two types of gayness. The homosexuality, which was in that text the negative kind of gayness, and then the gayness of like the upper crust elites, nobility of society, where the men would get together casually and have sex with each other kind of gayness, and that was okay and preferable. And my understanding is that is what we're talking about here a little bit. The other piece, going back to your earlier comment, I think that's here, is that certainly gayness as an identity emerged in Europe before it emerged in the areas that he's describing as the Orient, right?
Oh, okay, very cool.
But also this sort of idea of Orientalism, which was a very, I mean, I'm astonished that this person is writing in the latter half of the 20th century. It's a very 19th century, very Victorian idea. And, you know, people who were kind of artsy and, you know, a little bit anomalous would adopt these sort of Oriental habits. They would wear turbans and silk robes, and in some way, it, you know, adopting those kind, or decorating your home in a certain exotic way, and in that way, it sort of gave you permission to pursue different expressions of your sexuality, because it certainly wasn't British. It was something from abroad, and you were dabbling in it.
Are you talking about like the Lord Byron kind of Oscar Wilde type, like the dandies?
Yes, I guess I am referring to that.
Okay, that's really cool. I like that connection.
I just did a quick Google. I don't know if it showed up on your screen. I don't know if it switched for you, but Edward Said's famous book Orientalism, which really takes apart this whole notion of Orientalism, and in particular the ways that sexuality is applied to sort of Orientalism, and the ways it's related to colonialism and so on and so forth. That's not till 1978.
Oh, okay.
So
wow.
Okay, let's keep going.
Okay, for the Muslim, there is a law, and this law states that before his marriage, he may not go with women. But the Quran does not mention that a young bachelor may not go with a boy. So this is quite simply why many of the young unmarried Muslims like to be together with boys, and often later, after they are married.
Interesting. I tend to take these theological pieces as completely meaningless when it comes to actual sociology. I don't think people actually operate that way in reality, outside of maybe a very small number of elites. But what an interesting association that there seems to be with the Muslim community.
Well, and this is exactly how things were explained to me, you know, in the late 70s when I was traveling in some of these areas.
Oop, I didn't mean to do that. Just one note, Muslim Today, this is totally not connected to what we're saying, but Muslim Today is almost always spelled with a U, by the way, and in some old texts you see with an O. The reason it's not spelled with an O today, and I'm gonna get this wrong, but the word, when you pronounce it with an O sound, it means something really bad. I forget what it means.
Oh, okay.
But something really bad. And with a U sound, it means is closer to how it's supposed to be.
So you're supposed to say Muslim
Yeah.
as opposed to Muslim.
Exactly. And
You'll hear a Muslim too as well.
Yeah.
For you, Muslim or Muslim.
But just something to know that, and this is not true of older texts. In 1955, this is not what it was about. But today, most of the time, sometimes people just don't know, but most of the time, if you encounter Muslim spelled with an O, you're dealing with someone who's intentionally promoting Islamophobia. It's one of the like clear giveaways that you're dealing with someone who's promoting and engaging in bigotry when they spell it that way. Again, sometimes people just don't know how to spell. Like I have lots of empathy with those people. Okay, let's keep going.
In contrast to the Oriental Jew Muslim mentioned above, the Oriental Jew may start very young to enjoy the pleasures of both men and women until the time of his marriage. Among the soldiers, and oftener among the unemployed men, there exists a limited form of prostitution, but it is of little significance. This easy state of affairs in Israel might well be brought about by the genuine independence of the women. They are frequently found active in business, teaching, and vigorously practicing law. Many are even to be found in construction work and government planning. Ours. One often sees the lesbian type in Israel, but one seldom sees a lesbian. This instead is just their manner of behavior. Okay, and now I'm pretty steamed.
Anyone want to take that apart a little bit?
Oh, yeah, it's the women's fault. They're too aggressive.
Okay. Go ahead.
I was going to say, it reminds me a lot of what I've seen in some older American perspectives from, gay men back in the day, like, those 50s and 60s stuff where lesbians are still super invisible. I bet there were plenty of lesbians, especially if women were encouraged to be assertive and to, find professions that aren't necessarily feminine either. There was probably a lot of safety in that. I can't believe that there weren't many lesbians. I believe you probably just didn't see them.
I wonder if it has to do also with the women who were Zionists who came over and working on the kibbutz, and both for women and men to get rid of the image of weak Jews from the war, went like sheep to the slaughter, and instead they're taking control and, being very active physically, that kind of thing.
Nice. To me, the other thing that stands out here, and this is one of the conversations I think we've come back to in every single session that we have done, it's kind of the opening conversation we had, the relationship often between homophobia and misogyny, in the ways that they can just be intimately linked, in fact, almost always are intimately linked together. And I think we're seeing this here too, right? There is this dismissal of the possibility of, first of all, there being lesbians there, but we're also looking at the notion, right? He's saying one often sees the lesbian type in Israel, but one seldom sees a lesbian, right? And so what we're talking about here are people who are transgressing, women who are transgressing what this author understands to be sort of standard appropriate gender norms, and that transgression itself reads to others as being the same as these people being lesbians, even though in Israel that's not what this is about, is sort of the summary of, I think, what he's saying there. But just such a like intermixing of his own misogyny, right? His being the author here, and the misogyny of the society, and the homophobia all those things sort of brewing together.
But this author is, he's also racist and classist. There's a real level of snootiness on his behalf, you know, that he's going to go there and he's going to have a good time. But there's a certain sort of, you know, I'm kind of above it all. I'm just describing this in a rational, intellectual manner. And he evinces a certain level of condescension toward women, toward Muslims, toward people of the East.
For gay men.
Exactly. Gays, lesbians.
I do not like this author at all.
No, he's pretty hard to take.
No, I'm kind of seething myself. This almost reminds me, it's the same time period, I think, written. And to me, this is, I just find something hard to believe that this could actually appear in a gay magazine. But some of you might recall back in, I think it was around 68 or 69, a horrible book that was praised by most people in our society. And I think the title of the book was All You Wanted to Know About Sex But Were Afraid to Ask, something like this. And if you read the part in this book on homosexuality, it was so disgustingly unbelievable.
It was complete
view of what homosexuality is about. This reminds me of that.
Yeah, I hated that section of that book.
Oh, it was horrible.
It was.
When I was trying to come out as a young man, and then to see this, and that this is what the doctors and the medical community thinks about me and how sick I am. Oh,
yeah, I didn't read it until 81 or 82, and it still made me very steamed.
But that's what this reminds me of.
Oh, yeah, it does.
Right, and this is what was being published in one of the very early gay magazines in America too, right? Okay, any last thoughts on this text before we go to another one? Just a reminder for those who are watching on Facebook that if you'd like to join the conversation, there should be a link at the top to click on that'll take you to the Zoom meeting so you can actually be a part of the conversation. Oh, this was a really fascinating text. This was a really fascinating text. Okay, so this is, let me see the page so I can give you page 351 if anyone is following along in the book on their own. So this text right here is from a Syrian rabbi living in Jerusalem in 1960. And I think it will explain itself as we go. Yeah, this is a really fascinating text. So who would like to read?
To my honorable friend, the great Rabbi Shoshan Cohen, the rabbi of the settlement of Eton.
Okay, so this is a guy who is a very well-regarded Sephardi rabbi from his era. He's a Kabbalist, meaning he is a mystic. Has anyone, just quick show of hands, has anyone studied Kabbalah before? Yeah. So can be really, really interesting. Kabbalah also tends to be very sexual, or at least uses sexuality as its metaphor. Some might say as its sort of foundational metaphor, but almost always a very heteronormative sexuality. And the other thing to say is that Kabbalah in the Kabbalistic traditions often are some of the most misogynistic voices that you will find. Mm. So just a little background, because you're going to see some of that here.
Regarding a question that was brought to him concerning a boy who was circumcised as usual, but then fell ill and was taken to the hospital and stayed there for some 6 months. The doctor sent for his father to tell him that after the test, they determined that this child was actually female. And by the age of 6, it would be necessary to perform surgery to allow him to menstruate. And they advised the father that it would be best, while the child was young and did not know right from wrong, to operate on his genitals, meaning to remove his members so that he would become female.
Okay, let's pause there. What are we dealing with? What's happening here? What is this setup?
Obviously a child born with male genitalia and female genitalia, or female organs.
Okay, so we're dealing with an intersex person.
Yes.
Okay. And actually, I can't believe that this is going to be relevant, but anyone who was in the last Talmud class that we just did knows that one of the very strict prohibitions that exists in Judaism is over the neutering of an animal or a male human being. So that's going to be one of the questions that is going to be one of the practical issues that this person is deciding from. Does that make sense? Any questions on any of this or thoughts?
So I wonder what is right or wrong about it.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm kind of heartbroken that there's like this sort of, I don't really know what the right term is, but like sort of unconscious admission on the part of the doctor that what they're doing is a bit cruel. Did not know right from wrong, while the child was young. So they acknowledge, and in their minds, it was probably a case of the child won't know that they're intersex, won't know that they're different. But it's just kind of heartbreaking to me that, they're like, let's get it over now, and I don't know.
So this is one of, actually I would say this continues to be one of the areas where significant human rights work is being done, anti-LGBTQ, where I don't know what the word I'm looking for here is, right, where there continue to be many doctors who, when children are born intersex, they push to do immediate surgery to correct the problem, right? And more what we're hearing are voices of people who say, no. If this person, when they grow up, decides that they want to have some sort of surgical something, let them make that decision at that point in their life. Don't do surgery at birth or when they're young. This has become a really, are people familiar with this?
Yeah, I am.
So you'll see it's kind of interesting, and Noam talks about this in his introduction to this text, that, right, like, this is a rabbi here with a very different worldview, and as you'll see in a moment, a pretty misogynistic worldview also, but who serves as a halachic basis for not operating on children to make them conform to some false gender binary that some people wish existed. Okay, let's keep going.
Thus his father came to ask Rabbi Cohen whether there was some issue of prohibition here or some concern, since according to the doctors, the surgery would be necessary for the, okay, I'm really ignorant, here's what this word is. Okay.
Menstruation.
Okay, never seen it like that. Okay. And so it seemed there was an issue of danger. And in a case of danger, we rely on the opinion of the doctors.
Okay, so right, just to make sure we're clear on this setup here, right? The doctors say, go do surgery now. This dad is not so sure that this is the right thing to do, and goes to the rabbi and asks the rabbi's opinion. And the rabbi's first answer is to say, in things that are medical, normally we would say, don't ask a rabbi, do what the doctors say. We're about to get a big but.
But since Rabbi Cohen could not find explicit discussion of this issue among rabbinic authorities, for he lacks books, he therefore desired to know the opinion of this humble one according to his knowledge of Torah.
Okay, Rabbi Cohen has said this is above my pay grade and has asked this Syrian rabbi to respond instead.
You know, I don't know if anybody else, maybe I need to reread it, but I find it interesting that the first decision was that this is messed up, so we need to remove his thing and make him a female, versus it being the other way around of interesting.
This continues to happen, and many of us look on this as abuse today, but right, that there are things that they will like measure genitalia with, and if it's longer than a certain amount, they'll call it a penis, and if it's shorter than a certain amount, I don't know what they call it, but they make determinations on what this child's proper gender should be or sex should be, and surgically make it look more like their image of what it should be in response to that. And so this is no different. I mean, this is exactly what's happening here.
This has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but I just saw on my phone that there's been it's a large earthquake in Idaho and Montana. So I'm not certain what's coming out of that.
Right.
I know. We need something like that
now. Okay, let's keep reading.
Is that at the top? Is that where I am?
Mm-hmm.
This is my response first. According to what is described in the question, that after circumcision, the doctors declared him to be female. It is clear that this is a case of the androgynos.
Androgynous. Who was this the second class maybe that we did? First class? I don't remember. Who was here when we studied this text actually from the Mishnah? A few hands there, right? There is a whole discussion in the Mishnah about 7 different genders. I shouldn't quite say genders. The rabbis, like many people today, don't have a full understanding of the distinction between sex and gender. And so all 7 of them fall into various categories that might be sex and might be gender. But the Talmud has 7 different categories of people, because the rabbis and when we say the rabbis, we're talking the rabbis of the Talmud. They're very aware that human biology is not as simple as some binary. They're just totally aware of it. And so what's really interesting about this text for 1960, and one of the reasons I think it makes it in this compendium, is that it is one of the first contemporary uses where contemporary thinkers, as much as 1960 is contemporary, are picking up categories from the Mishnah in a really, what we might consider a progressive kind of way. I'm not sure calling this text totally progressive is the right phrase, but yeah. Sarah.
Can I pop a little plug? There is a wonderful website called Trans Torah where Elliot Kuhn, who I believe is a rabbi, and Joy Layden talk extensively about some of these issues and how it relates to being trans or non-binary, and it's really, really cool. It's an awesome read.
Cool. Thank you.
Can you repeat the name of it, please?
Trans Torah.
Trans Torah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
So let's keep going.
Okay, I'm just writing this second. And indeed, there is a long Mishnah in the 4th chapter of Bogard dealing with this. From all this, it is clear that the androgynos is considered closer to male than female, for he can marry a woman but cannot be married to a man. And he is clearly obligated in all the commandments of the Torah like men. Therefore, just as castration is prohibited for men, it is prohibited for the androgynous. So that has the same question that I asked, or I think, if I'm understanding it this way, why did they choose to go that way? Isn't that what this is saying?
Yeah. And you're going to see, unfortunately, the reason why, well, keep reading.
But there is room for disagreement, for we know that if a full male is castrated, he he will not be able to have children. But this is not the case with the androgynous, for he has both maleness and femaleness. Thus, even if they castrate him by removing his male genitals and make him into a woman, he could still have children if he is married to a man.
It's just worth noting that this guy like does not understand human biology and science. Like
Not at
nothing
all.
here is science. It's just worth saying that as we go into this section. Yep.
And make him into a woman. He could still have children if he is married to a man. This is not the same as the castration of a man or a woman. I'm getting dizzy now. Where after castration, they cannot have children. For here he can have children, as I said. But in the end, males are obligated in the commandment of be fruitful and multiply, while women are not obligated in this. And so by means of the castration, which turned him into a woman, his obligation in the commandment of be fruitful and multiply has been completely forfeited, as indeed has his obligation for all the commandments in which men are commanded more than women. This lures him in holiness, from the holiness of men to that of women. Oh,
okay.
I
So
saw what's going.
right, like his reason for this is pretty misogynistic and terrible. I just, the one thing that I kind of want to hold on to here, like our president, who often says the quiet things out loud, right? Like, how often, I don't know if other people have heard this also, but I must have heard 30 different times. Jennifer, I'm going to mute you because I keep hearing hand noises. You can unmute yourself whenever you want to talk. But how often have you all heard, again, I must have heard it 20, 30, 40 times in traditional settings that, oh, no, we have these very strict rules about what men can do and what women can do, but actually it's because women are holier than men.
Yeah.
Right. I see all sorts of people nodding, right? Like, I appreciate that at least this guy right here is just saying the quiet part out loud, that no, this is misogyny. Okay, thoughts on this so far?
Don't like it.
It's really sad. Like, so when they talk about castrating an androgynous, like
RG, by the way, is the way you say it. Androgynous.
Androgynous. Okay. Whenever they talk about that, I am low-key wondering if there's any kind of history where there was an individual who was assigned male at birth and then had what they thought to be a removal of the penis.
There's a very famous case like this that actually happened about this same time.
Okay.
I cannot think of his name, but they messed up his circ, and the doctors told the parents, we will just make him into a girl. And he was never happy. And as he got older, he ended up committing suicide because he was a little boy. They tried to make into a little girl. And I wish I could think of his name, but I cannot. I think he was Canadian.
Yeah, I've heard other stories like
First name is
that.
David.
David something.
Huh.
It's just very heartbreaking. These attempts at biology, like you said, you can tell he doesn't really know what's going on here, and he's trying. It's really it hurts.
The ending of this text is going to be a little better, I promise.
Good.
Yeah. Okay, let's keep going.
Regarding the claim of the doctors that by age of 6, surgery will be necessary for menstruation, meaning that they will need to remove his member to prevent some danger of female menstruation. And this constitutes a danger, heaven forbid. These things have no basis whatsoever, and there is no danger for a man to menstruate. And in fact, I myself know clearly that there are some men who have menses. Is that how it's pronounced? Is that how it's pronounced?
Yeah, keep going.
Okay, and they are healthy and fine and married women and have children and nothing has happened to them. The words of these doctors are empty and meaningless and have no basis in fact. Indeed, in the Mishnah of Berkowitz, it says that androgynos is made impure by a menstrual emission, like women, etc. And therefore, if there was any danger in this, the rabbis would not have remained silent on it. Therefore, heaven forbid that we would permit the surgery and change him to a woman, which is completely and severely prohibited. Wow.
Okay, right, better ending than the middle paragraph. Okay, thoughts on this text?
I'm so sorry. I know I've been talking a lot, but
No.
I have like multiple. I got so excited when he said there are some men who have menses and are healthy and fine, because that feels so trans affirming. And then he says they have married women and had children, which either means that someone's lying about the paternity, or they actually had a form of bladder cancer that was super common and still is common in places that don't have proper water filtration, where parasites actually like burrow into the bladder and cause periodic bleeding. So,
wow,
it could be anything.
that's a really interesting fact to have waiting for you right there.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are some records of ancient Egyptians talking about men having menses, and it was discovered through, of course, the wonderfully preserved bodies afterwards that they suffered from a form of bladder cancer. It's also common nowadays in places like Burma. So
yeah, we have this ending which almost feels trans affirming and heteronormatively anti-gay. Like it's a very odd ending here. Okay, other thoughts?
I'm just happy they didn't do surgery on him.
Yeah. In that in many ways is why Noam includes it in his book, because that continues to be a contemporary issue.
Am I the only one
Strikes
who had
me
problems?
is that there seems to be such a need to be one way or the other, that it seems to be, it was very hard for people to accept that one could be both. Now, it could also be an attempt to avoid problems later on. You know, in other words, if you set a child in a particular direction from distress later. I mean, I can imagine that would be something that was sort of
I would like to know how, as a man, that they could, his main, he had to be fruitful and multiply, but that wasn't necessary as a woman. But how's he going to be fruitful and multiply without the woman? I mean, that's rather difficult.
Are they talking of multiple women with that one man?
First, hold on. I want to go back to what Lisa said for a moment. Lisa froze at the end, I think. Did she freeze for everyone else too?
Yes.
Yes.
But I think one of the things that Lisa brought out there that's really worth holding on to is this rabbi who's making this ruling is not doing so because of progressive reasons, but instead what he's doing is saying that this false binary that society at this moment in 1960 in Israel, in the West, in the whatever wants to put into place is not consistent with Judaism's, I don't know what you call a binary that's 7 categories, but right, Judaism's much more expansive traditional understanding of this, which is different than progressive. So thank you, Lisa. In terms of be fruitful and multiply, the question is that the rabbis are dealing with when they say that this is a mitzvah for men and not for women is who is obligated by this commandment, meaning who is doing something wrong if they are not fulfilling this commandment? And the answer is men, not women. So it's a whole long explanation how they come to it. And I don't even remember the answer, though I can remember sitting in Karen's kitchen in Jerusalem, our first year rabbinical school, studying this text. Not this one, but the text that talks about this. But that is the answer that they come to, that this is an obligation, a mitzvah, that every man has, but not every woman has.
Except
Wait,
that
my
a
apologies.
value is based on how many children she carries, especially how many sons that she bears.
Yeah, right. And goes against some of the other pieces of sort of misogynistic stuff here. Yeah.
So this child was born in 1960.
Yeah.
Okay. I thought this was translated. I misunderstood. That's kind of weird then. That's, huh.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, there's a similar discussion today because there are some, let's try to get this straight. In some states, there are movements to work into law what society can do to parents and children. I don't know if I'm saying this right. There are some parents who have recognized their children talking about how they really feel like a boy when they are biologically girl and vice versa. And therefore they are helping that, and these parents are helping the child to do this early, I guess you could say, transitioning, and even to the point that some children, and I don't know what age group I'm talking about here, are being allowed to have surgery to start doing some changing, I guess. And so there's a big debate, and of course, over this, that wait a minute, because we know what what they're after here. They're after here that transsexualism is not something, you know, that should be. So there is this conversation going on today, and this just reminded me of that.
John?
Oh, I just wanted to say that most places won't let children start having any gender affirming surgeries until they're at least 16. So before that, it's usually more like social changes, like haircuts and clothing changes. And then like at puberty, sometimes they'll have puberty blockers, which just delay puberty until they're ready.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you. Really, really, really important. And that's one of the distinctions between like what happens in reality and one of the things you hear in like right-wing media sources about this. Right. I'm the parent of a kid who falls into that category. And like you just don't hear about kids who are having surgery. It's just not what reality is. So there are bills right now, it's worth saying, in the Missouri legislature that they're actively trying to pass that would make, for instance, puberty blockers illegal and considered to be child abuse, which,
that's what I had been reading lately, and it's kind of this religious and scientific or medical kind of. No, medicine and the scientific is not real. You know, this is what you really shouldn't be doing. You're really messing things up here.
Yep. Okay. Any last thoughts here before we go to another text? Okay. Let's look at some poetry. This is on 359, page 359. If you have the book in front of you. And this is the poetry of Edward Field, who I believe is still alive, though this was written in 1963. Okay, no, he must not still be alive. It's written in here like he's still alive, but he was born in 1924, so it seems very unlikely. But I guess possible. Okay, someone want to read this poem for us?
If one is a Jew who has a history, meaning simply to remember and be sad, then Ruth became a Jewess when Naomi kisses in her Gentile blood turned the rumors garrulous in her veins.
Okay, hold on. Let's maybe, you know what? Let's read the whole thing and then we'll come back and we'll read it slowly.
How easy for men. They offer up their foreskins. How strange she felt before this God, who was, after all, only a voice in the clouds. So she solved the question as later other Gentiles did. She made the one she loved her Godhead. At first, the rabbis were shocked at this liaison, but what could be done? She ate no pork. Oh, it keeps going. And obeyed all the sacred laws. So being wise, they turned it into a moral lesson and loved her since she was lovable. And when the people learned the official approval, all of Israel blessed this union, which they had been secretly admiring anyway, as Ruth and Naomi, lip to vaginal lip, proclaimed their love throughout the land.
Okay.
That's different.
Let's take this slowly. Any responses to the poem as a whole before we go through it and sort of take it apart? Okay, let's take it apart. You want to read it again for us, a few lines at a time?
Okay. If one is a Jew who has a history, meaning simply to remember and be sad, then Ruth became a Jewess when Naomi's kisses in her Gentile blood turned the rumors garrulous in her veins.
Okay, someone take this paragraph apart for us.
Sounds like there was the suspicion that Ruth followed Naomi because they were lovers. They were
Okay,
lesbians.
right, like anyone who's read the book of Ruth knows that there are, you can certainly read that between the lines there, certainly as much as exists with Jonathan and David. What is the story of Ruth and Naomi? Anyone want to give us a 30-second version?
Naomi was Ruth's mother-in-law, and Naomi lost all of her sons. She was left with nothing, no protections, going back to her homeland, and she told her in-laws to go home, and Ruth said, "No, I'll follow you. I will, and your people will be my people." Blah blah blah.
Right, and this becomes the model for conversion to Judaism. First of all, right, your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God, and where you go, I shall go, and where you were buried, I shall be buried. I'm sure I'm forgetting that and getting in the wrong order and these sorts of things. Ask a Christian pastor. They can all like quote verses so much better than rabbis can. Have you ever noticed that?
That verse is
Oh, no.
often used during wedding ceremonies, so they have to say it a lot.
Nice. So what's this first paragraph saying then?
I love that line about to be a Jew, you just have to remember and be sad, like, oh gosh, is there any joy in our lineage?
Yeah.
Maybe there's a reason why joy and oil are so close together.
Okay, let's take the next paragraph then.
How easy for men. They offer up their foreskins. How strange she felt before this God who
Okay,
was.
pause. What's the reference there to foreskins?
Circumcision.
Which is traditionally a part of conversion.
Conversion.
Ah, okay. How strange she felt before this God who was, after all, only a voice in the clouds. So she solved the question as later other Gentiles did. She made the one she loved her Godhead.
Meaning what? What is this saying?
Here that Naomi is the divine figurehead for Ruth.
Okay, nice.
Did she make the one, I don't know, too simplistic, that she would accept this God because of Naomi?
Okay.
Is it alluding to people who convert for like they're getting married to someone of like they're a Gentile and they're getting married to a Jew, that kind of thing.
I think that's what it's alluding to here also. Yeah, I think you're picking up on that, Sean, particularly during this era. That was really common. I'm forgetting, when did Marilyn Monroe convert to Judaism? Are you all seeing me type here so you can see how terrible I can't spell anything?
The Jewish Marilyn.
She converted in 56. Right. In fact, it was such a to marry what's his name, the playwright Arthur
Miller.
Right. In fact, listen to how I said it, right? To marry Arthur Miller, she can write that. And so so Sean, you're certainly picking up on a sociological phenomenon that's happening at this time. I also think it's saying, like, those of you who think she converted because of faith are crazy. She converted because she was in love with this person. And it wasn't like converting. It was, where you go, I will go because I love you.
Who is the author of this poem? I got lost.
Edward Field.
And who is he?
He was born in Brooklyn in 1924 to Ashkenazi immigrants. He was interviewed for Kinsey's Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. He, gay man, poet.
Okay.
Yeah.
The contemporary of Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah, he won all sorts of, I mean, there's like endless lists of the awards he won for his poetry.
Thank you.
Okay, let's keep going.
As for the rabbis, at first the rabbis were shocked at this liaison, but what could be done? She ate no pork and obeyed all the sacred laws. So being wise, they turned it into a moral lesson and loved her since she was lovable.
Okay, what's this paragraph saying?
They knew she didn't care about being Jewish, but she didn't commit any sin, so they accepted her because they wanted her in the tribe, I guess.
Okay. And she needs to be in the tribe, right? She's the grandmother of King David, by the way.
Yeah, that's true. I was thinking Marilyn Monroe, not Naomi.
It kind of reminds me of a class I had where our professor was talking about how normally, the traditional thought at the time was pretty negative and skeptical towards converts, but because, like you said, Ruth's an ancestor of David, she kind of gets a pass. They're like, all right.
I could be reading this wrong too, but what I'm reading in this also says that I think what this author is saying is, like, anyone who reads the story of Ruth and Naomi knows that they are lovers, unless you come into this with an agenda of wanting them to not be. I could totally be reading this paragraph wrong, but that's what I saw in this paragraph. And so they turn her into a moral lesson and loved her since she was lovable. Okay.
And when the people learned the official approval, all of Israel blessed this union, which they had been secretly admiring anyway, as Ruth and Naomi, lip to vaginal lip, proclaimed their love throughout the land.
We have this second to last line here, just in case he was being too subtle up until this point about what he was trying to say. Okay, thoughts on this? Okay, let's read the next one.
Sounds like Israel, the people of Israel, had already blessed this couple and this relationship, and it took a while for the officials to agree that this was something holy.
Oh, nice. Okay, totally separate poem for the next one.
Let me ask a question here, though.
Yeah.
But if this would have been, and maybe you can't, I don't know, maybe you can't compare. Is it easier for them to come to the conclusion of, let's say, acceptance and blessing this couple? Is it easier to do that because they were two women versus it being two men? No reactions? I don't know.
That's a really good question. I kind of feel like the ability to turn it into a moral lesson and cover the relationship is the defining factor of why they're able to love her. I think what confused me about the "she was lovable" line is here we see that, Israel blessed the union, secretly admiring anyways. So we kind of assume here that Israel is loving Ruth because she's lovable, when it seems like Israel loves Ruth because she was lovable to Naomi.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure what to do with that either. Yeah.
And I think it's strange because if Naomi or the two of them is the lineage for King David, but they try to ignore the relationship between David and Jonathan. So it's not okay for if they're homosexual.
You almost could use this exact same line in the same approach, right? He, in some ways, he could have written that about Jonathan and David the exact same way.
And I think there's something to be said for traditional sort of ideas about gender roles here. The idea that women make home and love and family, and men are supposed to go out and work and do also spiritual pursuits, and women are, the bringers of love. And the idea of two women coming together as being this sort of almost Platonic idea, because also, everyone thinks that women can't have sex with each other. So, it's romantic without being frightening the way that two men together can be for some people.
I think that's really
something about the gender roles too, is that they're not two young unmarried women, they're two widows who have already been married to men and had children.
Interesting. Yeah. Huh. I hadn't thought about that. Nice observation.
I think I really liked how the author went ahead and clearly defined the sexual relationship in connection to what I'm so sorry, I don't know. Lauren?
I'm Hannah. She's Lauren. Hi.
What Hannah was saying, that it, like said, there's this idea of like love and platonic, deep emotional relationship. And I love that he went there and was just like, no, they're definitely physical lovers. They are having sex. It's a part of their relationship.
Okay, let's go into this next poem. This is not a biblical allusion poem, nothing like this. This is actually just...
Excuse me, Daniel.
Yeah, please.
I have just one more thought about that last poem, is that there's something in there about, the norms of a society changing. And sometimes I think we have lost sight about, how much, of course, there's more progress to be made, of course, but even from like a decade ago, things that are freely talked about and acknowledged now. I mean, I have no problem turning on a television and, seeing people talk about their spouses of the same gender on game shows or something like that. And that just wasn't something that was going to happen. But here, it's like when somebody in authority acknowledges it, says it's fine, then everybody breathes a sigh of relief. Well, we wanted to accept this anyway, but we were afraid. So there's something there about how this happens, that very often a society wants to make a transition into being more accepting. And they're just waiting for somebody official or somebody to confidently go forward and say, this is perfectly fine. And then everybody can just accept it. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, totally. So I'm very aware that we are over, I can't believe we are over our hour and a half of advertised time for our final session. So we won't judge you if you need to get up and leave. But I want to read this last poem. I think it's a nice end. It's, so one of the things that it says, same poet. One of the things it says in the little bio that Noam gave us about him is that, like many queer folk from this era, grew up being told that his queerness was wrong and evil and something he needed to recover from, and created some really significant, as we can imagine, psychological damage throughout his life. And he eventually gets over that and eventually becomes sort of a very proudly, openly gay man, and talks some about his awful childhood. So I think this is, with that as an intro, I want to go ahead and read this poem. Will someone read it for us?
I'll read it. The Sleeper. When I was the sissy of the block who nobody wanted on their team, Sonny Hug persisted in believing that my small size was an asset, not the liability and curse I felt it was. And he saw use for my swift feet with which I ran away from fights. He kept putting me in complicated football plays, which would have gone spectacular if they worked. For instance, me getting clear in front and him shooting the ball over, or the sensation of the block, the sleeper play, in which I would lie down on the sidelines near the goal, as though resting and out of action until the scrimmage began, and I would step onto the field, receive the long throw, and to the astonishment of all the tough guys in the world, step over the goal line for a touchdown. That was the theory anyway. In practice, I had the fatal flaw of not being able to catch. I usually had my fingers bent back and the breath knocked out of me. So the plays always failed, but Sonny kept trying until he grew up out of my world into the glamorous varsity crowd, the popular kids of Lynbrook High. But I will always have this to thank him for, that when I look back on childhood, that 4 psychiatrists haven't been able to help me bear the thought of. There's not much to be glad for, besides his foolish and delicious faith that with all my oddities, there was a place in the world for me, if only he could find the special role.
Isn't that a sweet poem?
Very.
Yeah.
Really love it.
Okay, so that's 5 weeks for some of us just a couple weeks. It was kind of nice how this became virtual, and we got all sorts of different voices too who joined us. So that's 5 weeks of A Rainbow Thread. Really phenomenal collection. For those of you who missed session 3, which we did actually with Noam Sienna, is there anyone who didn't see that who's on right now? Totally worth going back. You can find it on either my Facebook page or on CRC's Facebook page. If you go to CRC's, you don't need a Facebook account, facebook.com/centralreform, and scroll down and you'll find it from however many weeks ago it was. But Noam Sienna, the author, compiler, editor, I don't know what word you use for something like this, gifter of this text, we had a session with him because everyone is in their home, so he's no farther away in Minnesota than we are from each other right now. So definitely worth going back and looking at that one. Any concluding thoughts, reflections, anything from this this university series? Okay.
I thought it was phenomenal. Thank you for opening our eyes to a whole new world.
No, I'm so grateful for Noam for putting this together. Yep.
Yeah.
But thank you for leading it. And also to everybody out there, because a lot of you are my friends, I'm going to be a great grandfather, and Liz will be a great grandmother tonight.
Mazel tov. How marvelous.
I can't believe this virus. I have to stay home and watch it on Family Album.
Rabbi Daniel, what series is going to follow this one starting next Tuesday, if any?
Yes, so starting next Tuesday, we just decided on this today. It was originally supposed to be and will be at some later time. Jill Delston, Dr. Jill Delston, a member of CRC, just published a book on what's it called? Sexism and medical ethics. That's not the title. It's a better title than that. But with all the craziness, we're going to put that off until the world's maybe, hopefully, God willing, a little less crazy. And so instead, Rabbi Susan noticed that there's a holiday on every Tuesday in April. So all of the rabbis have divided up the holidays. I forget who's doing what. And we're each going to be teaching one of the sessions. So all I remember is that I am teaching Yom HaZikaron, Israeli Memorial Day. Look at that. That's the end of April. So there will be an email that will go out about this again, 7 o'clock.
For a sad note, after Paul's, I just got a text that my brother's girlfriend's cousin just died from the coronavirus.
Oh.
It's getting closer.
Yeah.
Baruch Diana, man. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Let's hope there's not much out of this earthquake that was reported.
This crazy world.
How many more plagues can we inflict between now and next Tuesday?
Yeah.
I think 8 more, right?
Hannah, were you about to say something?
Yeah. So I start rounding on COVID patients at St. Mary's Hospital tomorrow. So spare a thought for us if you have a minute.
Thank you for doing that.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Hannah.
we're
But be safe
love to
and
you, though.
stay covered as much as you can. I know my niece is over at St. Luke's in the respiratory, and wow, I have so much more empathy and love for all the nurses out there and doctors.
Me as well.
Take care of yourself. We're sending you love.
Thank you.
Take care.
Stay safe.
Yes, thank you.
Peace.